a very, very special welcome this morning to Professor Chris Rowe, who is joining us from the University of Northampton. And Chris is the Perrott-Warrick Senior Researcher and the Director of the Centre for the Study of Anomalous Psychological Processes at the University of Northampton, which is very impressive sounding. He's also the visiting professor at Bucks New University. He's the chairman of the British Psychological Society, Transpersonal Psychology section. He's a council member for the Society of Psychical Research and a whole list of other associations. He's also on the editorial board for a number of very prominent and well-respected journals in the area of psychical research and parapsychology. Chris's research has been focused on understanding the nature of anomalous experiences, and that includes research on the phenomenology of paranormal experience and the psychology of paranormal belief and deception, which I'm sure everyone in the room will be very interested in. And he has done some experimental work to test claims for extrasensory perception and psychokinesis. So Chris has been his research more recently has been concerned about the relationship between altered states of consciousness and altered states of consciousness and the psychic and mediumistic experience. So today, Chris is going to give us a talk with PowerPoint illustration on extrasensory perception and dreams, and will talk to us about some of the more recent studies in this area. So we're all very delighted, very excited, Chris, to have you here with us this morning. So I'm going to turn the room over to you and let you now walk us through some of the research that you've been conducting. And like I said to everybody else, if you have any questions, please keep a note of them, and Chris will be happy to stay after his talk and answer those as best he can. So, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you. Firstly, I want to begin by thanking Karen for this kind invitation to speak to you today. I'm also a novice when it comes to Zoom, so we may have loads of technical glitches throughout this next hour. That's common experience in parapsychology. Very typically, equipment breaks, very unusual things happen during experiments, and I think we might want to treat this as a type of experiment. The first experiment is to see if I can get the PowerPoint slide shared with you. So hopefully you can see my first slide. And if not, do let Karen know, and I'm sure she'll find a way to let me know. So Karen mentioned that I'm director of a research group at the University of Northampton. We have quite a grand title that she gave you, CSAP for short. Essentially what we're interested in are anomalous experiences, the kinds of experiences that mainstream conventional materialistic science finds very difficult to explain. And so they end up really just trying to explain them away rather than treating them seriously and trying to investigate them on their own merits. And there's a variety of phenomena that fall into that category. We're particularly interested in the phenomena that relate to us as human beings. Maybe these kinds of experiences and these beliefs have something to tell us about what it is to be a human being. Particularly, many of us have a sense that there's a spiritual aspect to being a person that isn't maybe represented or acknowledged in more mainstream conceptualizations of being a human being that really bear a little bit more serious kind of inquiry and investigation. Right, so here's the first test. Let's click, and we get through to slide one. Fantastic. So broadly, we might describe the kind of interest I have as falling in the range of parapsychology. I'm kind of assuming people have quite varied backgrounds. This may be very familiar to some. I hope you'll bear with me if I just explain firstly that parapsychology traditionally is described in terms such as this. This is my favorite definition by Harvey Irwin and Caroline Watts, and they describe parapsychology as the scientific study of experiences which, if they are as they seem to be, are in principle outside the realm of human capabilities as presently conceived by conventional scientists. I like this definition for two reasons. One is because it focuses very much on the experiences. There can be no doubt that people have experiences. There are 7.3 billion people on the planet. Only about 1.2 billion of those are atheists. The vast majority of people then have spiritual beliefs and have experiences that they describe in spiritual terms. So there is something to understand. This definition allows us to understand some of those experiences, at least in conventional terms. Maybe people are over-interpreting their experiences. Maybe they have an experience that seems psychic, but isn't. It can be explained away in terms of traditional psychology, traditional physics, and so on. And we are very interested in those things, in those phenomena, because we still learn something from those. So I think that's an important aspect of what we do. But perhaps, unlike other areas of psychology, we also take seriously the claims themselves. We're open to the idea that our current understanding is limited, that there is scope for further development, for us to introduce some new ideas, some new concepts that will account for these special phenomena that happen. It's a little bit like a special theory of relativity, or that, you know, there are some phenomena that don't fit with the general description because there might be special consciousness in particular is involved. Maybe the conventional rules of physics don't apply anymore. Now, the first step really in trying to understand those experiences is to try and organize or categorize, develop some kind of a taxonomy. That gives us maybe an insight into how those experiences cluster together. Certain kinds of experiences or phenomena then might have a common explanation or might relate to a particular kind of capacity that we have, and other phenomena might be quite different and be described in quite different ways. Now, generally, we use the catch-all term psi, the Greek letter psi, to stand for those instances when people have a paranormal or psychic or spiritual or exceptional experience. Now, it's really important to emphasize that we use the label psi in the algebraic sense, that is, as a Greek letter that stands for something that as yet is unknown. So it's not an explanation, it's a kind of a page holder. It tells us, here's an anomaly, here's something that doesn't fit. Now we need to explore it and find out what's going on. But the term psi absolutely is intended to convey that we don't know what that thing is as yet. And within the taxonomy, we usually divide the phenomena into three different categories. So we have extrasensory perception, which reflects those situations in which particularly human beings, but also perhaps other sentient animals, seem to have awareness of things in their environment that goes beyond what's possible through our normal senses. So if a person has a premonition, for example, about a future event, that doesn't really make sense in terms of conventional senses. There's no way to know that information by ordinary means, and yet very many people report occasions when perhaps they've had a dream or they've had a sense of foreboding about something, and then some disaster has happened later on that's a confirmation of that premonition. Telepathic experiences would also fit into this category, where there are times when we think we know exactly what somebody else is thinking or experiencing, and there seems to be no traditional or conventional way of explaining it. As a quick aside, a good example of that is that Berger, the researcher who invented EEG apparatus, so the brain mapping apparatus that we find in hospitals around the world, in university departments, actually developed his EEG equipment in order to capture psychic waves. On one occasion, he was in Vienna and he was involved in a carriage accident. A horse and carriage nearly killed him. And at that very moment, his sister, who was having her afternoon nap, maybe 100 miles away at home, woke up in a cold sweat and had this terrifying experience seeing her brother being killed by a horse and carriage. She immediately sent a telegram to ask after him, and he was so impressed by the accuracy between her experience and his that he immediately set out to capture these psychic waves. Sadly, he was unsuccessful. Psi doesn't seem to work that way, but the whole area of neuroscience is built on that attempt of the equipment that he built. Another category is psychokinesis. So rather than information coming into the system, PK or psychokinesis reflects situations where a person seems to have an impact on their environment around them through an act of intention. But the classic example for people of a certain generation would be something like Uri Geller's spoon-bending escapades, where through an act of concentration is able to bend cutlery. But perhaps the best practical example would be various forms of psychic and spiritual healing, where positive intention seems to have beneficial effects for the patient, even in circumstances where we can't explain that away in terms of the conventional placebo effect or expectancy. So PK is a separate category. And then the third category, which is rather a hodgepodge of a category, is evidence of survival. Parapsychology is deeply interested in the notion of personal survival of personality after bodily death, and the kind of phenomena we're interested in to explore that issue ranges from certainly mediumship, and I've been involved with the SNU for perhaps 12 years now, trying to explore mediumship from a scientific perspective, but it also includes near-death experiences that people report, claims of past lives, apparitional experiences as well. So there's a range of phenomena that seem to speak to the issue of whether people might survive bodily death. And as well as ESP, there's another form of ESP, which is error someplace. So certainly there's a lot of interest in finding out what we can learn about normal human psychology, our capacity to fool ourselves and to be fooled by others. And it's really important to grasp that nettle and recognize that that's part of this picture if we want to have a whole picture. So why should we be interested in psi? Because surveys across the whole of recorded history, across different cultures and times, demonstrate that a significant proportion of people report belief in any of a range of phenomena. So typically, levels of belief range from about 1/3 of a sample through to about 2/3, no matter what the question is. So various questions about so-called paranormal phenomena, levels of belief in those things are extremely high. And you go on to ask people why it is they believe in clairvoyance, for example, why they believe in survival, why they might believe in healing. The typical answer they give is personal experience, either their own personal experience or that of people whose opinion they know and trust, so loved ones or close friends who've had these striking experiences themselves. And certainly when we've interviewed people, it's quite common for people to describe their psychic or paranormal experiences as being among the most profound experiences in their lives. One study I'm involved in at the moment is analysing a collection of cases, so written descriptions by people of experiences that were collected by Alistair Hardy. He was especially interested in religiousness, and so many of the experiences are encounters with God or the immanent God in nature around us, but there are a large number of psychic-like experiences in there as well. And people recount these experiences perhaps 30 or 40 years later, and there's still something that's very dear to them that really they feel has given them a glimpse or an insight into what it is to be a human being. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge those experiences, we take them seriously, and we try and find the best way to understand and explain them that we can. So I mentioned the idea of cases. So a case is simply a person's description in their own words of their experience and what it means to them. Probably the classic example of a collection of cases is with Louisa Rhine. So Louisa was the wife of J.B. Rhine, a very famous experimental psychologist who did lots of work on extrasensory perception, really from the late 1920s, and certainly was very high profile through to probably the late 50s, early 1960s. He invented the fairly famous ESP cards, so the cross and the wavy line and the circle that many people have used in fun games, tests for psychic powers. And he used those experimentally across lots of trials and got some really interesting results. So much so that he wrote a monograph, so a scientific report in a book form that was really intended for other psychologists. The print run was only about 500 copies, but it was picked up by the Reader's Digest in the States. It became their book of the month. And suddenly it was extremely popular in the US. People were very interested in these rather dry and dull experiments and the outcomes from these that kind of suggested that on occasions people could know things that they have no ordinary way of knowing. A byproduct of that was that people started writing to the Rhines at their laboratory at Duke University in North Carolina. And those letters very typically would begin by saying, I've just heard about the research that you're doing. I think it's wonderful. I'd like to give you a donation, perhaps $1 or $2 towards your research efforts. Oh, and by the way, while I'm writing to you, can I just share with you this particular story of something that's happened to me? And they might write very involved stories. Some of them are heart-wrenching stories of people who'd had apparitional experiences that were the way in which they were informed that loved ones had died during World War II, for example, or other experiences of loss or trauma for other people that they were close to. And the first instance of that was these psychic experiences that they'd had. And they shared them often in quite a great deal of detail. Louisa Rhine was very diligent at writing back to people, thanking them for the letters, but she wanted to do more with these, and she ended up analysing, trying to combine them together to see whether there are any common features to these stories, to these accounts. we're very open to the idea that people may be mistaken. So there are, in our ordinary life, experience is quite chaotic. There might be lots of factors or variables at work that we're not aware of that might explain away our experiences. And in our descriptions of them, they may be quite partial. That certainly might be true, but Louisa believed that if we collect enough cases together, then the kind of random stuff, the kind of errors and mistakes that people make would tend to fall away. And what might remain would be maybe something that's core or essential about the phenomena people were describing. Did we find that people from all places around the world tended to describe the same state of mind? Did they tend to describe the same relationship with the target person who's having the experience? And so on. Could we get some insight into the nature of these phenomena that might be useful for later, more formal experiments? And absolutely, what she found has been very profound. It's certainly influenced the way that parapsychology has developed as a science. The main thing she discovered was that primarily, for people who don't claim any special psychic gift, the most common situation in which they would have a psychic experience was when they were experiencing an altered state of consciousness. Now, this may be something that they cultivated or developed. Some of these people would be meditators, for example, might have cultivated ASCs through breathing techniques, and so on. But very often they were common or garden variety altered states of consciousness. That is, people were just daydreaming as they were doing the dishes, gazing out of the window, not thinking about anything in particular, and their mind was wandering. Or they may have been sitting in an armchair having an afternoon nap or looking at the fire. Or they may have been drifting off to sleep in bed. Before they were fast asleep, suddenly they had these experiences, or they were just waking up. So there are lots of ordinary states of consciousness which are different from our waking state. And those were the situations in which people reported psychic experiences. And that is certainly something we need to work with. Now, the problem, of course, is that we're all at home sleeping every night, so maybe it's just coincidence. And all those dreams, some of them are going to correspond to things that happen to people in their daily lives, and maybe we're just overinterpreting them. But Louisa Ryan found that when people had these dreams, they didn't feel like ordinary dreams. They felt different. They felt particularly significant, momentous, that they had to act on them. There's a very interesting DVD of a movie called Premonition that stars Sandra Bullock. And if you watch that DVD or you get hold of it, one of the extras is a documentary looking at premonitions. And there are a few cases of people who've been interviewed who had premonitions about plane crashes, for example, and felt so compelled that they actually were phoning around the aviation authorities trying to convey this information to somebody without success. Really acting out of character completely. So there's clearly a sense that these dreams are different from our ordinary dreams. We recognize there's something special. They do tend to concern people that are emotionally close to us. That could be an artifact. That might simply reflect that, if last night we had a dream that Sandra Bullock stubbed her toe, or will stub her toe today, that may indeed happen to Sandra today, but we'll never know about it unless it features in a gossip magazine or something. But there might be lots of things, trivial things, that we never get to find out about, that actually are played out in people's dreams. Also, in Louisa Ryan's collection, they tended to reflect serious rather than trivial events. So it would involve maybe death or serious injury to people. Those kind of profound situations were certainly much more common. Again, that might be an artifact of the way in which people volunteered their accounts. People are taking the trouble to write letters to somebody they'd never met before. Somebody seems very grand and serious. Louisa has her own PhD. They might think they don't want to bother her with something so trivial, and they might only cherry pick those very profound experiences. Where people have conducted studies to keep a regular dream diary and see whether any of those dream events are confirmed later, they find that it is just as likely that trivial events will be confirmed later on. So maybe that's not quite so true. So that kind of experience not only was reported by Louisa Ryan, but in a number of collections of cases, real people living real lives don't claim to be especially psychic, but they have these paranormal experiences, altered states of consciousness seem to be involved, particularly dreams. And that's why we should be really interested, I think, in dreams, that we need to focus on those as a way of nurturing psychic experiences under conditions that we've got more control over. Our problem with the real world situation is that they're often described pejoratively as mere anecdotes, that they don't really have much evidential value. So for example, if we have a lady here, Amanda, and Amanda reports having had a dream of a local factory being on fire, and her dream was extremely vivid and quite striking. There was lots of fire engines that went to put the fire out, but it was too late, and the place was burnt to a cinder. But it's quite a dramatic kind of dream. And she woke up the next morning to discover a news item on the breakfast news describing exactly that event. There is the factory on fire through the night as she was dreaming a couple of miles away, and it really is very reminiscent of the way she dreamt about it. The problem with this as an anecdote is that there might be some regular ways in which we could account for that experience that don't require it to be paranormal or psychic. Firstly, we'd need to know a little bit more about the chance baseline for these kinds of coincidences, a coincidence between the dream and the confirming event. For example, now how many fires are there in the UK that are reported on news programmes? Is it quite a common event? Is it quite uncommon? How often does Amanda and other people, how often do they dream about fires to factories? Until we have those kinds of baselines, we can't really work out the probability that on any particular night, somebody will have that kind of dream and think that it confirms a real event that's happened. And this is not helped especially by the problem of self-selection of cases. In the UK in the 1960s, there was a terrible disaster called the Aberfan disaster, in which a coal heap slid down the side of a hillside after torrential rain and engulfed part of the village, including the local primary school. Over 130 people were killed by this coal slide, including most of the children who were at the primary school. And there are some awful pictures showing these tiny white coffins all being buried together in a communal grave as part of that community. And the whole country was in mourning after this event. And one researcher called out to the general public and asked, well, you know, can we kind of prevent this type of disaster from happening in the future? Did anybody have any kind of inkling that this might have happened? Is there a way to build some kind of a repository where we can share dream premonitions and we can see if there's anything that might help us to prevent something? And he collected together some cases which are really quite impressive. But that is a case of self-selection. He advertised, for example, in the Manchester Guardian, that had a national coverage in the UK. But at that time, certainly 40 to 50 million people may directly or indirectly have had access to that call for cases. And he only collected together fewer than 60 cases. So it's very much cherry-picking those that seem most similar. And that makes it really difficult for us to get any sense of how likely those correspondences are. Shared antecedents, the third one, is maybe there's something that triggers both events, that triggers both the dream and the event that we think is confirming the dream. So, for example, in the case of Amanda, we may be less impressed by this correspondence if we later discover that she's the health and safety officer for that particular factory. Maybe we suspect at some level that when she's doing her rounds around the factory, she's noticed things that are not quite optimal from a health and safety perspective. Maybe those newspapers are a little bit too close to that radiator. Maybe there's a problem with the wiring in this part of the building. And maybe she's only registered that at an unconscious level. But the way that might play through is through a dream. So in a dream, we can express our unconscious concerns and desires. And that might be a way in which our worries become animated, become conscious. And so we'd be less impressed by that if we felt that there were some shared antecedents. Sensory leakage is probably less likely, but this means that maybe while she's dreaming, she suddenly is aware of information that is incorporated into her dream. If we discovered that her bedroom is on a main road and that the fire station is at one end of town so that the fire engines have to pass near to the front of her house to get to the factory, maybe at some level in her dreams, she hears these sirens, and sirens mean that the dream suddenly shifts from being some kind of benign pastoral scene to suddenly being about fire engines and a fire. It might be those kind of problems at work. And probably the biggest problem with real world cases is convergence during recall. What we very often find is that people will remember their dreams in ways that conforms more closely to the confirming event. So we'll tend to forget the bits of the dream that didn't fit so well with the actual events, and we'll tend to elaborate a little bit, not in a deceptive way, it's just human nature, but we'll tend to elaborate on ways that makes the dream seem to be a better fit for the event than it really was originally. And likewise, when we're perceiving the event, we'll tend to pick up on the features of the event that fit best with our dream and miss out some of the extra pieces of it, the extra features. In those ways, we tend to have a partial view of the dream and a partial view of the confirming event, it makes them match up much more closely than they really would do if we weren't so disposed psychologically. So these are problematic. What these mean is that we're never really in a situation where we can evaluate real world cases from an evidential perspective. They can't really constitute good evidence for a premonition or for clairvoyance, real-time psychic powers. Instead, what we can do is use this as a basis to bring things into the laboratory. And for Dream ESP, certainly the most important research was conducted in the United States at the Maimonides Sleep Laboratory. This is in New York State. It's a medical research facility. And they were in the vanguard really at this time. They had a sleep laboratory in the basement, and that was especially being used to explore people's sleep anomalies. People who had nightmares, for example, or sleep apnea. They were stopping breathing maybe while they were asleep and dreaming, and they could monitor people through the night, and they could maybe use that to diagnose them and maybe offer treatments. But there were a couple of psychiatrists who were attached to Maimonides who were very interested in psychic powers, and they had access to this laboratory as well. They were able to conduct dream studies, look for ESP, using their sleep laboratory in the hospital. This is really crucial because all of those counter explanations I just mentioned can be controlled for. They can be taken into account in designing these formal experiments. So in terms of chance baseline, we can control that if we make sure that we know exactly how many trials there are. We have a full record of what it was that people said about their dreams. We have a clear account of what the targets are, and we know exactly how many occasions we tested for ESP. So that makes it much easier, as I'll show you in a few minutes, easier for us to get a chance baseline, to get a sense of how successful should people be if they're just guessing. If there is no such thing as ESP in this experiment, how should they perform? It avoids self-selection as well because we specify in advance how many experiments there are going to be, how many participants, and so on and so forth. So we're very clear that that has to be something you declare in advance before you begin, and you have to stop when you say you're going to stop. In terms of shared antecedents, this is crucial in experimental work, and this is that you must make sure that there's no way that people can infer or guess at the nature of the target. But choosing your target material has to be randomly generated. There's a fabulous book, really interesting, by a guy called Upton Sinclair, published I think in the 1930s. Upton Sinclair was a socialite in New York State, very well known, very popular. He and his wife were celebrities, and they wrote a book called Mental Radio. And in Mental Radio, they described their telepathic experiment, husband and wife, in which they'd be separated across the house, different parts of the house. Mary Craig was very sensitive. She would recline, go into a mild altered state, she'd kind of drift off to a semi-sleep state, and she would generate impressions, and she would do drawings based on those impressions. And many of those are really interesting. They seem to match up very well with the drawings that Upton Sinclair produced that were her targets. They look to correspond really strongly. But the problem is that they would meet before they began a trial. They would talk to each other, and that might, because they know each other so well, they were husband and wife, it might, even with the best will in the world, set them thinking in particular trains of thought that might lead them to the same endpoint. Maybe they're going to the theatre that night and are both really excited. They're going to see that particular performance. And so when they're asked to think of anything, whatever they want randomly, they will maybe tend to think of the same kinds of things. So we need to control for that. With sensory leakage, well, that's easy enough in a hospital or in a laboratory. We make sure that there's physical shielding between the parties. It's not possible for one person to whisper to the other or to give away the target. These days, our biggest problem is mobile phones. We have to make sure that people give up their mobile phones. We keep them safely in a drawer, but they can't signal to each other and things like that. And errors of recall. Well, we can avoid that completely by recording what people say. We wake them up, we get their dream account, we record it, and we've got clear records that we can then apply whenever we want against the target. So how does that work in practice? Well, this is a typical situation. This is a scenario. So we have Stan Crippen there working the apparatus. That humongous computer there probably has less computing power, certainly than a mobile phone these days, probably a digital watch. That's more computing power than it. But that was being used to gather information from the participant, where we measure her brain activity, And also you see there's a sensor just on the side of the eye that measures eye movement. And this capitalizes on the discovery that when people are asleep and dreaming, at that stage, their body is paralyzed, so they don't act out the dream, but their eyes are not. And very typically, when people are having a dream, their eyes will move as they watch what's going on in the scene. So, for example, if they were dreaming about being at Wimbledon watching the tennis, their eyes would literally move left, right, following the rallies in the game. And we can monitor that. You get electrical impulse from that. And so we can monitor when people are dreaming. People don't dream all the time that they're asleep. There are different sleep cycles we go through, but we certainly dream maybe 4 or 5 times a night. And each dream period, although the time period varies, it'll be anywhere from about 20 to 40 minutes, depending on where it is in the cycle. And what this allows us to do is to monitor the participant. When she's asleep and dreaming, we can leave her to dream for a little while, and then we can wake her up. While she's still rather woozy and not quite out of it, we can ask her to tell us what it was she was dreaming. What was her experience like? So there she is, she's asleep and she's dreaming. Importantly, we have a physical barrier to separate her from the target, so there's no normal way in which you can know what the target is. We have a random method that we use to select the target, and in those days they used static targets, so they would use postcards, art prints, things like that, and there'd be various pictures that would form part of that set, so the subject matter could be really anything, and participants would have no idea. And then very often they would have a sender, so they'd have somebody who would look at that image and try and concentrate on it and communicate it to the dreamer. This might be somebody who knows the receiver, so knows the participant. And so, for example, I always think of this picture as being of a Greek boat, a Greek fishing boat, and it might cause me to reminisce about times we went on holiday to Greece, or how we've always planned to go, thinking about basking in the sunshine, sitting there fishing very quietly and serenely. So trying to find a way to engage with the participant. And we would do that during each of those REM periods. After about 15 minutes of the REM period, the dream period, the person would be woken up, they'd describe their dream, and they'd be allowed to go back to sleep. And you'd repeat the cycle through the night. And hopefully at the end of that then, what we have is a fairly rich description of the person's dreams, and we can see whether they seem to correspond with the actual target. So she's written those out, and that's our record now. We'd call that a mentation. That's simply a description of her experience. What did she dream about? What did it feel like? What was she thinking about? Those kind of things. So for example, you might say, I can hear water all around me. I have a sense of being in the open air. I can see clouds above me and they're green. Well, if this were the target, and this is the Titanic sinking, we might be quite impressed. I hear water all around me. Well, this is in the middle of the vast Atlantic. That looks like there's certainly water all around. I have a sense of being in the open air. Well, that's certainly true as well. It's certainly out in the open air. Clouds above me is less impressive. There's an explosion over here. Maybe that's something that people are picking up on. They're interpreting that as a cloud. And there's green. Well, it's kind of blue more than green. Maybe that's just a misinterpretation. So you might think there are some reasonable correspondences there. What if this had been the target instead? There's water all around me. Well, literally, this spider is surrounded by water, albeit little droplets of dew this time, so very tiny amounts of water compared to the Atlantic. But nevertheless, there's water all around. In the open air, well, it's literally dangling in the air. So that seems quite impressive. Clouds above me, well, maybe this wispiness is clouds, and there's green around as well. So without labouring the point, hopefully I've demonstrated that it's very easy for us to apply a description to a target and creatively see some correspondences, even though it relies on us making some kind of mental kind of gymnastics, really. Water all around me is extremely different in those two situations, but we might treat both as being a confirmation. What about if this was the target? We might struggle even more, but there's certainly clouds, maybe no water. And here's Christopher Robin and Pooh playing Pooh sticks. There's water running under the bridge. It's not quite around them. Certainly lots of green. We might think that's interesting. So what that kind of shows is, in these situations, it's not terribly helpful for us to show the person the target and say, what do you think? Does this match up with your dream? Because people are very good at seeing correspondences and will tend to be impressed. It doesn't give us a baseline for what we should expect by chance. So instead, in these experiments, what we do is we show the participant 4 pictures. So one of them is their target, the one that the person has been looking at during the dreaming period, but the other 3 are decoys. And so any of that tendency to creatively see connections or links will apply to all 4 of them, but won't help them choose which is the right one for them. In this situation, what we get people to do is rank order those pictures and say, well, based on my experience, I think the Christopher Robin one is the closest to my dreams. That's the one I'm going to put as my number 1 choice. The Titanic sinking, that's got some features that I'm impressed with. I'm going to put that as my number 2. The spider's web, that's got some features but less. Put that as number 3. The volcano, very little really for that one. So I'll put that as my number 4 choice. That now allows us to see that we have a chance baseline. If there's nothing going on, if people really are just guessing, they'll only pick the correct target 1 time in 4 or 25% of the time. They'll only put the target in their number 1 or number 2 positions 50%. So straight away we can see in our experiments under these conditions, are people doing better than they should be doing? Well, here's the result. If we treat on this graph here, so these are data that firstly Dean Radin talked about. He estimated that people performed better than chance, so better than that chance expectation of 25%, to such an extent that we should only see this kind of result 1 time in 75 million. But clearly, that's unlikely. Colleague Simon Sherwood and I analysed things in more detail in a slightly different way. And what we found is if this 0 point here is chance level, across a series of studies, only 2 studies were below chance, where people's guesses worse than we'd expect just by chance. And for very many, they were way above chance. So people were performing much better than they should have done. They were putting the target in ranks number 1 or number 2 much more often than they should be doing if it's just guesswork, if there's nothing in their dreams that relates to the target. So this is quite powerful. It shows people have a rich, spontaneous experience. There are ways to explain that experience away in conventional terms. We can bring it into a laboratory where we take those conventional explanations into account and rule them out. Nevertheless, people are still doing better than they should be doing. So those explanations can't explain away the experience. Now, the problem for us in much of our work is that people can't afford to run a sleep laboratory. It's very expensive to keep a lab like that. You don't get much data for your money either. You typically get 1 experiment per day. It's your whole night just to get 1 trial run. And we don't have staff or particularly participants these days who are very willing to give up a whole night's sleep just to contribute to science. We have to find ways to be a little bit more creative. So typically experiments since Maimonides have had people sleep at home as normal, but keep a dream diary. So they would wake up spontaneously, perhaps through the night, but certainly in the morning, and they'd keep a record of the kind of dreams that they could remember. While they're at home doing that, in the university and the laboratory, under lock and key, there will be a computer somewhere at a specified point in our studies at Northampton between 2 a.m. and about 6:30 a.m. It would kick into action, it would randomly choose a target for that person, and it would present that target, either a static image, or in most of our studies, it will show a short video lasting about a minute, and it'll play that video over and over and over again through the night. This is under lock and key. There's no way to access that space, security guarded and so on. There's no way in which the person at home could ever get access to that target by normal means. And all they do then is they sleep at home, they bring along their dream diary, and we go through that judging procedure as before. When Simon Sherwood and I looked at outcomes from those experiments, we found a very similar picture to the Maimonides. There are more failures now, so there are more studies that didn't find an effect, or even people doing worse than chance. These are kind of at chance, where it's very close to the midline. But there's still a bunch of studies here that are really interesting and very difficult to explain away. Collectively, across this whole sample, there is a significant effect. So statistically, people in these studies are also able to identify a target just from their dream content. Their dreams seem to relate to a video that they've never seen before, and they've no idea what it might be. I wanted to say just a little bit more about the experiments we've done at Northampton. In particular, we are very interested in altered states of consciousness, as Karen mentioned. And some of that work is inviting people in to participate in our studies. We have a model that we work with ordinary common or garden people. We don't typically work with people who are psychic claimants, so we're not in the business of testing individuals, but we welcome people who believe that they have a rich psychic history. We've had people who are practicing mediums before who've participated in our studies, with the caveat that what we're asking people to do may be quite different from what they do professionally, or where their actual ability or capacity is. And there may be an element of, asking somebody like Linford Christie, an Olympic runner, to high jump. Just because you don't succeed in our situation doesn't impact on your original claim. So this is Northampton, this is where we're based at the moment. And we've run a series of experiments just to give you the outcome. We didn't start out terribly well. Our first study had an overall hit rate of only 17.5% in that original study. The dots here represent the actual average performance, so the overall percentage, and these represent the range statistically. So this was a result that we would have expected just by chance. That red dot there represents how people should have done if they were just guessing. Every other study we've conducted to date, and we're in the middle of a study at the moment, so I don't want to tempt Providence by telling you how that's going, but every study to date, we've had participants score above chance. So albeit 29% in the first, the second study, these two are both at 32.5%, 30% here, and this is just over 30%, nearly 31%, that's the combined total. So independently, as a group at Northampton, running studies typically with university undergraduates, so people who don't claim to be especially psychic, we're able to show that if you give people the right kind of environment, one that nurtures these kinds of experiences, in particular, I suspect, because it depresses people's natural skepticism, that self-talk that tells people that this is impossible, that they can't do this. We very often say that in other experiments. We have a very difficult task in trying to get people to behave naturalistically. They come along to a study, we chat with people, and very often we devote maybe 30 or 40 minutes just to finding out about them as people. Why have they come in today to do this study? Have they had a long interest in parapsychology and psychic experiences? Have they had any experiences they want to share with us? And we are genuinely interested in the things they have to say. Part of it is to build up a sense of knowing who they are and a sense of rapport, allowing them to trust us with their experiences. And then we move over to do the experiment. But as soon as you mention, okay, let's begin the experiment now, the atmosphere changes, it's much more formal, you can feel them stiffen up a little bit, and you can tell now that they're not going to behave naturalistically anymore. Now they're performing, now they're going to be psychic, instead of just allowing things to happen or emerge as normal. The Dream ESP studies, I think, help to avoid some of those problems, because although you might have those worries when you're drifting off to sleep, they've disappeared by the time you're asleep and dreaming. But I wanted to show these data to show this isn't something that's just happening in other parts of the world where maybe the methods they're using are not kind of legitimate. We're very confident that the methods we're using effectively rule out normal explanations, and nevertheless people are doing better than they should be. We don't see people getting 100%, so we have quite variable performance. So, thinking back to the study I'm involved in just now, there are certainly days when it's very clear that people's dreams have nothing to say to the target video, and then other days when your jaw will drop. It's literally, the analogy I draw is, it's a little bit like showing somebody the video clip and then a week later asking them to remember what the video clip was like. So it'll tend to be a truncated version, so much abbreviated. They might get one or two details wrong, but essentially they can give you an accurate description of the clip. And at times that's what we see in people's dream diaries. It's so clear which is going to be the target that it's astonishing if it doesn't turn out to be. I wanted to mention those occasions when it doesn't turn out to be the target, because we have a bizarre problem in the method that we use with something called a displacement effect. We have a couple of good examples from this last week in the study I'm involved in, actually. We have trials in which people come with their dream diary, and it seems to be such an accurate description of a target video or picture that must be the target, and it turns out that isn't the target at all, and we call this displacement. So in one of the studies that I conducted on one trial, the participant said sitting around a table with my family drawing pictures of fairies, their fairy wings, and this was the only trial for which fairy guardian was one of the alternatives. But on that trial, it was a decoy. It wasn't the picture that had been chosen by the computer, and it wasn't the one that had been showing all through the night. But during the judging, that's the one that gets concentrated on, that we focus on. One of our dreams this week, we have a collection of people, 5 of us who are keeping a dream diary. 3 of us had interactions with white animals, and for one person, the animal was talking to them. One of the target clips was white animals that were talking to each other. We've never seen that clip before. It's never come up in another trial. And this is, we're about 15 trials in. And it was astonishing that 3 of us picked up on white animals, talking animals, and it wasn't the target. On another trial, somebody reported a dream in which they were swimming underwater. They were surrounded by a selection of pretty, brightly coloured fish. And one of the alternatives was fish in the ocean. And again, that wasn't the target. And what it kind of suggests is maybe for some people, what they're picking up on is not the video or the picture that's been shown by the computer in real time, but maybe their experience when they turn up to do the judging. That when they come and they see the pictures, they engage with one image more than the others, even if it's not the target. They're drawn to it, they're attracted to it, and that de facto becomes their target. And in our experiments, participants often feel that this is still good evidence for ESP. If they've had this dream and this was one of the alternatives, that clearly looks like something out of the ordinary was going on. That's something that we're wrestling with at the minute. So that's kind of a whistle-stop tour through the kind of research that we've been doing. The postscript is that there was a very recent update. Lance Storm is a colleague of ours in Australia, and together we put together another review of all of the Dream ESP studies to date. We've got this published in a mainstream dreaming journal, which is really nice, just to make sure that other people know about this kind of work and see it as legitimate. And now there are 52 studies there with 51 different experimenters contributing to this set of results. Again, this line down here that ends at 0, that's the chance baseline. If there's really nothing going on, that's where the dot should be. But in fact, the dot shifts right over here to the right-hand side, that people are doing better than chance. And this line is the kind of range that you'd expect for significance. So although it doesn't look like much on this graph, this is extremely difficult to do just by chance. This really shows that something, whatever it is going on in these studies. In trying to explain it, it's important to stress, we've done too quickly, that this database is produced by a number of experimenters in different laboratories around the world. There's no real sense that only one laboratory, maybe in some suspect kind of way, is getting all the significant results. Pretty much every laboratory is reporting at least one significant result. They're certainly different from chance, and that's quite astronomical. So that's 10 million to 1 against getting that kind of a result from those data. And it's not related to how well done the experiments are. There's not a one-size-fits-all. People vary the conditions of their experiments. Some are better than others at dealing with ways in which you might be deceived or be deceiving yourself. And there isn't a relationship here. So the best quality studies are producing the same kind of effects as the lower quality studies. One important feature is that dynamic targets are doing better than static targets. There seems to be something about the degree to which the material is something you can get immersed in, that you can engage with, that you can have a connection to. And it's much harder to do that when you're talking about a static art print, say, or a landscape scene, compared with, say, a very active dynamic video clip that runs for a minute. And certainly our money is on things that are a little bit more emotional. Typically, negative emotional material works better than positive emotional material. That might just be because people find negative clips more interesting, so they look at them more closely. But evolutionarily, it also makes sense. If telepathy is real, and we're very much open to that idea, then it must be genetically coded for in some way. It must have a selection advantage, survival. And so the best way to understand that is if it was fine-tuned to provide us with information about situations in which we would be in danger, or family members or people that we're genetically related to were in danger, but we could do something about it. We could help them avoid that situation, or we could come to their aid. But it would make sense that these kinds of capacities are fine-tuned to seek out danger and trauma, potential adverse situations that would fit in with that. So I've rabbited on for quite a while here. I'll just summarise and then hopefully open things up to questions. It's really important in what we do that we start with people's lived experience, and that ultimately what we do speaks to those experiences. Otherwise, as far as I'm concerned, we're mostly wasting our time. It's really important to us that we find out what kinds of experiences people have in the real world and make sure that we build our experiments around those. And it is certainly true that people have psychic and paranormal experiences. And when they have them, they're most likely to happen when they're in an altered state of consciousness. Meditating, taking drugs of different sorts, in quiet contemplative prayer would be another situation, and also drifting off to sleep and waking up from sleep. Focusing on dreaming in controlled experiments has been a useful method for producing effects that can't be explained away in terms of those standard explanations. These positive results have been produced in different labs using different methods, so it's not really a case of badly designed experiments. And some of the target properties are really important because it makes them seem more psychological. It fits them with the complexities of being a human being. So negatively emotional clips and dynamic clips are better. Some personality types are better than others. So creatives do particularly well in our experiments compared to others. People who have spontaneous experiences also do better in controlled experiments as well. So there's a linkage there. People who are extroverts tend to do better than introverts, but I wonder if that's partly because they can very quickly accommodate to new situations. And so they can very quickly become at home and relaxed and behave naturalistically. Whereas for introverts, you need to be exposed to that same situation a few times before you feel relaxed enough to be yourself. But there are lots of ways to conduct sound research on Dream ESP. As long as you have those key features, physical separation between you and the target, some random method for choosing the target, then it's possible for anybody to do these experiments at home. And that's where I want to finish. Please do think about doing your own experiments to understand your own experiences, and do get in touch if there's any way in which I can help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was really, really fascinating. If you want to just stop your screen share, then we'll be able to see you large in our screens. Perfect. And I'll open the room up to questions. If everybody there can see, there's a little chat box that you can open up. I think on the bottom of your window, you can click on chat, it'll open up your chat box. And if you have any questions there, please feel free to type them in and we'll go through them with Chris. And while we're waiting for that, Chris, actually, interestingly, we're going to have Dean Radin with us next month. You mentioned.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so that should be interesting. All right, just one thing before we go to questions, Chris. One thing I thought was very, very interesting there was when you were talking about people's response to negative emotional experience versus positive emotional experience, which is fascinating because we sort of think ESP is sort of some advanced evolutionary thing, and what it's showing is that it's still giving us that sort of fight or flight emotional response to take care of our survival. So kind of interesting there. But yeah. I had one experience with that was on that tip. It just reminded me of that just before the Fukusitsu, if I'm pronouncing that properly. You remember the reactor meltdown in Japan a few years ago? And there was a tsunami afterwards. And I remember having dreams for weeks before that about water and drowning, and they got worse and worse and more vivid and weirder, and then stopped after that, after the reactor meltdown. And I believe a lot of other people were having similar strange dreams building up to that. Do you have any ideas for, is that a collective kind of consciousness that's bringing that to us? You know, you talked about premonitions. Have you come across that before, or do you have any?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's one of the thoughts behind building these repositories. So there are 1 or 2 repositories now where people can lodge dreams that they think are meaningful in advance, and they can then be analysed to see if there are patterns that are emerging. It's interesting that you mentioned Dean, because he was involved in a famous study where they were looking at internet chatter before 9/11. And they discovered that in the kind of random chatter that they looked at, the incidence of particular words that related to terrorism and to that particular incident heightened just before the event, probably during the period when the event was being planned and when, you know, the groundwork was being done for it. And but in that nebulous way. So people weren't saying things like, I think there's going to be a terrorist attack in New York City, but they weren't perhaps using particular kind of terminology more often, So absolutely, there may be a sense that things are occurring at an undercurrent level that doesn't maybe bubble through to consciousness in quite subtle ways. Its purpose is twofold, and perhaps on occasion, its purpose is for us to intervene and try and change those events. In some of Louisa Ryan's cases, very interestingly, people found that when they had a premonition, they were able to prevent that event from happening. But that's bizarre, because if you prevent the event from happening, then what was it a premonition of? Because that event never happened in your future. So it's kind of bizarre. We get in mental twists and turns with it. But it certainly shows. Yeah, so it shows that that's possible. The other thing that I always think of now is, in some of the cases I've been looking at, so we've interviewed people and we've conducted focus groups. And in those, people have shared their premonitions. One lady I think of, for example, was talking about a car accident she was then involved in. And so she had these premonitions about the car accident, and the car accident still happened. But she still took comfort from the premonitions because she felt it was her way of coming to terms with an imminent event. So its purpose wasn't to prevent the event from happening, but in some way psychologically to prepare her for that. And so perhaps on occasion that's its purpose, is to just help us to kind of reappraise things, get a better perspective or balance on things before this event hits. And so the psychological damage of the event is maybe less.
Interesting. Okay. I'm just going to go to, I have questions that we could be here all day, but I'm going to turn it over to the room. So Monique Backer has asked, the lady who was asleep while the video was running, did she know that she was going to receive a video of some kind?
Yes, so in those studies, ethically, it's really important that people know exactly what they're agreeing to when they agree to participate. So in all of our studies, people will know that the intention is to explore ESP. They will know that there'll be another person in a different room on those trials who will be watching a video and communicate it to them. And so people have to be comfortable with those. A key thing here, crucially, is if one is open to the idea of telepathy, then it's impossible to have deception in your studies, because they will know at some level what's really going on. And it completely undermines the whole process. So that's crucial, I think. Many of our studies are precognitive. So we'll have people produce their dreams, and then the target will be chosen after the fact. And for some reason, that it's wonderful, because in terms of the design, it means there's no possible way for you to know what the target will be by normal means, because when you're having your experience, it doesn't exist yet. The computer's not chosen it yet. So it's a lovely, clean design, but people find that it's a bit further along for their boggle threshold, the idea of precognitive stuff. They don't seem to mind in dreams. They seem to accept that. Because very often our dreams do seem to relate to a future event, not to something that's contemporaneous.
Interesting. Great. So Jas said, you said that highly charged negative videos tend to work best. Do you know if situations that are personally meaningful to people have a higher hit rate than normal?
We don't know. I think that's very likely, but our problem is that we haven't effectively found a way to measure that. We can't choose video clips for their targets in ways that are tailored to the person, because they have to be truly random. But otherwise, they would pick that target as their choice because they're connected to it compared to the decoys. It wouldn't work in that way. And we can't ask people after the fact at personal meaning, because they know what the target is by then. And so it's confounded by the fact that they know the identity of the target. In the real world, absolutely, I think meaning is primary, above and beyond everything else. And certainly, if we look at how it is people arrive at the target, if it's, I don't know, Bruce Willis in one of the Die Hard movies, that's the clip, very action clip, guns. People don't come along typically with a dream diary that says, well, I saw Bruce Willis in a vest. But what they will get is a sense of dynamism, a sense of urgency, a sense of threat. So they capture it in that kind of language, which absolutely speaks to meaning, much more than kind of literal features. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
It sounds a little bit like the sort of language or the sort of results that they found when they were doing or analysing or assessing the information that was gathered from remote viewing studies as well, where it's this sort of shape, colour, where it's very, very easy to add 2 and 2 together to get 5, which is what we were talking about when you were showing the different targets earlier. And that's quite, but that idea of trying to get 2 and 2 and realising what you actually have without adding to the picture. So it sounds like quite challenging work.
Exactly. And there's a key there, that there's an ego self, which is your chief saboteur. So your chattery self is always undermining and spoiling these things. So the more you can get ego self out of the way, I think the more likely you are to be successful. Absolutely, in those RV studies where people are latching on saying, oh yes, clearly, this is a cooling tower, or this is a submarine or something, that's not helpful. Stick with the core impression that you're having and hold that as long as possible.
Yes, that always always something perhaps grey and metal. So quite a few people have had, and are commenting on the idea and have had premonitions. Pamela said that she knew several people who had premonitions about the World Trade Center, and Jas said that he had experienced something like that tsunami experience I had in his development group. And Angela said as well she had a more personal one, a premonition about ending up in hospital during a holiday, and was able to actually use that to do some damage limitation, which you spoke to earlier, which is very interesting. And Miriam had a very vivid dream when her children were small, both of them in a river, unable to swim, not knowing which one to say first. Oh, how awful. So she put the eldest into swimming lessons, and nothing happened. So I suppose, yes, being able to take action on premonition seems to be a very useful thing. So I would think that also speaks to your comment of negative emotional experience and survival component to it, and then being able to take action on it. So very interesting stuff. Before we let Chris go, and just if you have anything you wanted to add, Chris, or if there's any final question there, please type it in.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to pick up again on that idea. I think one take-home piece of advice, what we're very keen to do with the SNU is to encourage people to be their own critical friend, to be a practicing scientist themselves. So think about your experience, think about ways in which you can transform it into more robust evidence. So absolutely, when it comes to things like premonitions, the key thing is to keep a regular dream diary and note the correspondences for yourself. And then you would start to recognize the features of your dreams which are potentially meaningful, and which elements of your dreams tends to be the kind of things that you have in your dreams and what really carry that importance. Chris Robinson is quite a famous medium, quite a famous psychic rather, in the UK. And he very often seems to have premonitions about terrorist type attacks. And when he does, he pictures the terrorists as black dogs. Every time he has a dream and he sees black dogs running around a particular place, that's what it indicates to him. It's a way of recognizing your own personal symbolism so that you have kind of a ready translator. And you start to, and one of the things you do, 2 things happen if you keep a dream diary. One is you find that you can recall your dreams better than you did previously because you're becoming more disciplined with it. And you start to know yourself a little bit more intimately, and you perhaps notice some of those trivial correspondences that are confirmed later on that you would have missed, you would have forgotten them, and the event when it happens isn't important enough to trigger that memory. But if you keep a dream diary and reflect on it a little bit, then I think it gives you access, I think, to a source of intuitive insight, really.
Yeah, and that seems to be, Pamela's just also typed in there that a few years ago, she was with her horse, and she didn't want her to leave, and seemed to want her to wait. And then when she didn't wait and drove home, she ended up in a car accident. So perhaps even animals have this sensitivity as well. But it also raises another interesting point, just before we go, which is when you're talking about keeping a dream diary, it sounds to me like it would be an important thing to understand what's just noise and what's actually premonition. Because if we were to take I know some of my dreams, my God, if I was to try to organize and orchestrate and schedule my life according to those, I'd be in a bad way. But where you actually then need to sort of learn like with mediumship, I suppose, in a way as well, you have to learn over time. You learn the difference between what's your own thought and what's the thought from somebody in the spirit world. It sounds similar in the dream environment, where if you perhaps keep a diary or you work with this, you start to learn the difference between what's your own sort of neurological noise and what actually may be premonition, so that you can weed out what is the information that perhaps you should be paying attention to.
Exactly. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Lovely. All right. Brilliant. Well, I want to say thank you again, Chris, very, very much for joining us this morning. It's fascinating. I always love dreams and studies, dream studies. I must get myself into one sometime. I want to thank all of you there as well for joining us this morning and for sharing your experiences with us. Chris is actually at the University of Northampton, so you can just Google him there and you'll find faculty information there on the university website. And if any of you have any comments, you can feel free to leave them on the Facebook event page, which I have made for this. Comments are always welcome. I hope you all enjoyed it very much. We will try to do a replay midweek for people in unfriendly time zones for this time on a Saturday, and hopefully we'll get to share Chris's work with some other people there as well. And do join us next month as well for Dean Radin, who will be here. As Chris mentioned earlier, he's done some very interesting work as well. So again, thank you, Chris, very, very much. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you here next month.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.